Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the sixth and, for the moment, final installment of our Beyond Bytown virtual talk series. My name is Steve Mattiusi. I'm the manager of visitor experience at the Bytown Museum, and I am joined once again tonight by my colleague Renee Hayward. Now, as always, I'd like to begin this evening with a land acknowledgement. So the city of Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, and the peoples of the Algonquin Nation have lived on this territory for millennia. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this place. So just to let everyone know, in order to share this with those who couldn't join us tonight, we will be recording this talk. Now, as I mentioned, this is the sixth and, again, for the moment, final talk in our Beyond Bytown series. So since the beginning, Beyond Bytown has been a series that seeks to bring to light stories that are either more contemporary or haven't received as much attention as perhaps they should in the sort of history community here in Ottawa, or both of those reasons as well. So our talk tonight will focus on the history, the current condition, and of course the future of the tech sector in Ottawa. Growing up in Ottawa, personally, I always heard about two distinct but important employers in the National Capital Region. That was the government and the tech sector. Maybe this was because I was born in the 90s, which seemed to be a pretty good time for tech, or maybe it was because the first job I remember my dad having was working at Nortel. I don't know. So to discuss the history of this sector and where we are going from here, we're pleased to be joined tonight by a couple guest speakers who know the ins and outs of Ottawa tech. So first and foremost, we have Luc Lalande. As a recent university graduate in 1984, Luc noticed a job posting in the Ottawa Citizen describing a new and unique organization, the Ottawa Carleton Research Institute, and was intrigued by the position description. OCRI, I got that right, at the time was established to connect Ottawa's growing technology industry with partners in academia and government. And since then, he has been directly involved in Ottawa's research and technology-based ecosystem, government, university, and industry. Over the past 4 decades, he's observed the high and low points of the city's evolving tech sector and offers a wide-angle yet nuanced perspective on its past, present, and future. In 2002, he was honored to receive the Des Cunningham Award from the OCRI for outstanding leadership in forging business education partnerships. And of course, we are also joined tonight by Rob Woodbridge. So Rob Woodbridge is a 30-year Ottawa startup participant as a founder, CEO, COO, advisor, and mentor, and is currently the COO of Trexity. And I hope I pronounced that right, Rob. Excellent, I got a nod, perfect. So before I hand things over to Luc to give us a rundown of where Ottawa's tech sector began, I'll quickly give an overview of tonight's events for everybody. So Luc will be starting us off with a history presentation, then we'll bring in Rob to join the discussion. The discussion is going to cover where the sector's been, where it is now, and where it might be headed, using several key indicators to frame that discussion. Towards the end, we'll open it up to an audience Q&A. So if you have a comment or a question, do not hesitate to type it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And also, if a question comes to you in the middle of the presentation or in the middle of the discussion, don't feel the need to hold on to it until the end. Please type it in the Q&A as soon as you think of it, and we will do our best to get to all the questions and comments that you folks share with us tonight. So again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and thank you to Luc and Rob for agreeing to participate. And with that, I believe I will hand things off to Luc.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve, and also a big thanks to you and your team at the Bytown Museum for your superb organization and the invitation to give this talk this evening. Also want to say thank you to my colleague, Rob, who will be co-presenting this evening, and a big thanks to all the people who have joined in for tonight's presentation. Okay, so we're going to kick off with the first slide, which is a photo. And I posted this photo on my LinkedIn profile just to see who could actually guess who that company was. And it was fairly quickly revealed that it was Newbridge Networks. This is a picture taken at a Christmas party in 1986. And why did I choose this image to kick off tonight's talk? Well, for me, it really much encapsulates the past, the present, and the history. In a way, the picture is a bit of a metaphor for me in terms of time. One way we're looking down at the photo at the people looking up. So even though it's a snapshot in time, these people 35 years ago are looking up to the future, while in a way we're looking down at the past. And there are many stories that are entangled with Newbridge Networks, and not only with the company, with all the individuals who were in that picture. Some have gone on to be mentors and investors. So our pasts are very entangled with the present and the future. And as Einstein once said, that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. So tonight's talk is not just about looking in a nostalgic way, but also understanding what the past means for the present and what it means for the future. Okay, so Steve mentioned will be the outline for the talk tonight. We're going to do a flyover of the three distinct eras of tech in Ottawa. After that, we're going to have a more current outlook on how Ottawa stacks up in terms of key indicators, in terms of the health of the technology sector. And then we're going to conclude with some questions and answers. Now, for those who'd like to go into sort of a deeper dive on tonight's talk, there is a link at the bottom of the slide, which includes my background research notes. So what I've done is I've put in about 100 hyperlinks. In a way, it's a bit of a self-guided tour of Ottawa's tech history. So if you want to go down rabbit holes of history, this is where I would like to direct you to go, because there's so many interesting stories that I can't possibly cover in tonight's presentation. So I certainly encourage those who are curious to go further to go check out that link. Next slide. Okay, so since it's a flyover of Ottawa's tech history, I thought it would be interesting to separate what I see as three distinct ages or eras of tech in Ottawa. So in a way, it's a bit like geological periods. There are periods that stretch over millions of years, and then there are other periods that are much shorter, more dramatic, and so on and so forth. So even though these are roughly what I see as the three principal eras of tech, clearly you can imagine there are also sort of periods within these eras. But again, just for the sake of time, I won't go into that level of detail. So the first part is R&D. And I think from this presentation, you'll clearly see that research and development really is the bedrock of Ottawa's tech ascendancy and emergence as Silicon Valley. And there had been a long gestation period, which then led to this incredible period called the Golden Age boom and bust, which I roughly define as 1995 to 2001. And then following that period is the lost decade and fresh founders. And even though they could be distinct periods from 2002 to 2021, I did put them together, and you'll see for a reason. Now you'll notice I put a question mark after the year 2021. It is, I think, an open question that the pandemic represents a discontinuity that may usher in a new age of tech in Ottawa. Now, the key things with these three eras of tech in Ottawa that I will cover in this presentation will be significant or defining events that characterize each of these periods and related what I call spillover effects, rather than recounting the specific histories of companies. Now, as a backdrop to the history of tech, I cribbed this slide from a wonderful presentation that Steve Blank, who probably well know from Silicon Valley, who did a really wonderful presentation about a decade ago called Hidden in Plain Sight, The Secret History of Silicon Valley. And what he did with this slide is he presented the successive waves of technology that Silicon Valley itself experienced. And why do I say this is a backdrop? Because Ottawa experienced the same technological waves in the background. It's not that the technological waves were unique to Ottawa. They were felt, experienced all over the world. Now, I also put on the bottom right of this slide a really interesting book written by Carlota Perez. Some of you might know Carlota's work in studying technological revolutions. And one of the main points of her thesis, or her points of view, are that each of these waves of technology come in what's called the installation phase and the deployment phase. So in other words, there's a period during these waves where there's rapid installation of new technologies, and once that infrastructure is in place, there's a deployment stage or a layer of value-added services that grow from those waves. So going back to World War II, there's a big red circle around microwaves and defense. And interestingly enough, Ottawa shares a lot in common with Silicon Valley in this regard. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, research and development really was the bedrock of Ottawa's tech emergence as Silicon Valley North. And first and foremost, it started with public research and development. The wartime scientific research effort really was led by a few agencies, in particular the National Research Council, which during the war grew from 200 employees to over 2,000. And the NRC was doing work primarily on the transmission of radio waves and the effect of the ionosphere, and also in high resolution radar. Interestingly enough, one of the devices that they were doing research on the radar side was called the cavity magnetron. These were even manufactured by Northern Electric at that time. Another very important player in the public R&D side is the Radio Propagation Laboratory, which then became the Defense Research Telecommunications Establishment, and now known as the Communications Research Center located in Shirley's Bay. And the third very important public R&D player in the mix is the Defense Research Board that was formed in 1947, which represented a collection of several military research laboratories, which included the Radio Propagation, then renamed Radio Physics Lab in Ottawa. Next slide, please. Just before we get into Northern Electric's story, I really wanted to mention that the presence of the first high-tech company in Ottawa was Computing Devices of Canada. That was started in 1948 by two immigrants from Poland. So in a way, Silicon Valley North started almost a decade before the first major tech company in Silicon Valley, which was Fairchild Semiconductor, that was established in 1957. So that's kind of a fun fact. We had maybe a head start in terms of a high-tech company in the Ottawa Valley, roughly or slightly ahead of the Silicon Valley's first major tech company. The next big private R&D player was, of course, needless to say, is Northern Electric. And I want to thank someone on LinkedIn who I met when I posted the information about this talk, who found this advertisement in the Ottawa Citizen from 1965. Now you'll notice, if you can, I don't know if you can see the fine print on this slide, but this basically is an advertisement by Northern Electric talking about the establishment of its Research and Development Center in Ottawa, and also its Advanced Devices Center, which was going to become Microsystems International in 1969. Now, Northern Electric's research and development presence was started in 1959. Its first R&D presence was actually in Belleville in 1958. But soon they set up shop in Ottawa in 1959 and 1960 at what we now know as the Moody Drive location in Carling. And that was the beginning of Northern Electric's research and development presence in Ottawa. Next slide, please. And here's a forgotten anniversary. Bell Northern Research, which was an amalgamation of Bell Canada's research and Northern Electric research, established in 1971. So this year we're celebrating 50 years of BNR's existence, which I think is something definitely worth celebrating, because Bell Northern Research, I wouldn't even say arguably, was the preeminent research and development laboratory of Canada, and certainly put them in the big leagues of North American R&D, along with IBM Watson, Xerox PARC, and Bell Labs. And concurrently, another important milestone in 1971 was the introduction of the first commercially available microprocessor, the Intel 4004 on your bottom left screen. Okay, next slide, please. By 1981, what was going on in Ottawa was already being noticed in other places. The New York Times carried this article in May 1981, even referring to Ottawa as Silicon Valley North. So we were certainly establishing a reputation for excellence in research and development, but also because of entrepreneurial venturing, which is the next slide. And I think these two people need no introductions. As you know, Michael Copeland on your left and Terry Matthews on your right represented to a wave of visionary entrepreneurs that started companies in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s that came to maturation a decade or so later. But what I want to mention about the spillovers of the research and development era that I just described are three particular things. One is the research and development era attracted talent from all over the world, but particularly from the UK, which Michael Copeland and Terry embodied. Other people included John Roberts. We had people like Adam Chwiniak come here, and the list goes on and on. So people, or engineers in particular, were attracted to come to Ottawa as a place to work on cutting-edge technology. So there was a huge, huge magnet effect of that R&D. The second effect, or the second spillover, was the network effects of connecting this diversity of people with ideas and ideas with people. So a lot of networking was happening at the time. A lot of ideas were popping up, and ideas for new ventures, new market opportunities. So the network effects during that period are particularly important. And as I mentioned, there was also a slew or a spillover effect of visionary entrepreneurs. What is interesting, though, in showing the difference between Silicon Valley and Silicon Valley North was a lot of companies in Ottawa started at that time were not VC backed, as opposed, or venture capital backed, but were supported through some angel networks, or angels rather, and government programs like IRAP. Versus Silicon Valley startups that were often supported with venture capital, which was very early stage at that time with companies like Kleiner Perkins, Sequoia, Davis & Rock, and Van Rock, among others. So now we're going to jump into the second era. And next slide, please. Okay, so some of you might recognize Antoine Paquin. And this is really a defining event of the second era, which I refer to as the golden age boom and bust. As you'll notice, the period of time here is significantly shorter than the long R&D period, but many things came to bear at that point. And this is about the period of time that I got myself engaged in the tech sector. I was really smitten by what was happening. It was a very exciting time for Ottawa tech. The sky was the limit. There were wild predictions about Ottawa doubling in population from 800,000 to well over 1.5 million people. There were even predictions at that time that Ottawa's tech employment would be reaching 200,000 people by the year 2020. So I think a defining event of that period was when a little company called Skystone Systems was acquired by Cisco in 1997 for the unheard sum of $89 million US for a company that was barely 18 months old. And I think for those of us who were active in the tech community at that time, that was like a meteor just struck the earth. It was this incredible boom that took a lot of people by surprise to some degree, but it also set off a number of spillover effects. And one of those spillovers was indeed this recognition by venture capitalists, particularly in the US, that Ottawa was a hotbed of investment opportunities. In fact, the amount of venture capital went up from $125 million in 1998 to over $1 billion in 2000. But more subtly is the Skystone acquisition also set off more acquisitions. There were companies like Extreme Packet Devices that was bought by PMC Sierra. Connexent bought Philsar for a huge sum of money. So this set off a whole other wave of startup entrepreneurship. In fact, this is the period, I think, when Ottawa really, caught the Silicon Valley VC-backed startup bug. So there was just a slew of startups happening at that time. And also, as I mentioned, just personally, I found it very interesting that top-tier VCs were coming to Ottawa all of a sudden. I remember hosting an event at Carleton U back in the early 2000s when Greylock Partners and More Davidow Ventures brought all their partners up to Ottawa. It was unheard of to see so many VC partners from top-tier firms aggregate in Ottawa, but it was just a sign of the times. And those will remember there were also calls for direct flights from Ottawa to San Jose and Silicon Valley. And that did last for a little while, but soon after, when the bus came, that route was stopped. Next slide, please. I think some other important events during the boom period was clearly John Roth's right-angle turn at Nortel, signaling Nortel's move to fully digital. It was a transformational change at Nortel. They acquired a company by the name of Bay Networks for billions of dollars, renamed Nortel to Nortel Networks, but also again more importantly, it was a sign that they were willing to acquire startups at really high valuations just to acquire leadership in intellectual property and technology development. Now, there was a lot of criticism around that time about the high prices that Nortel was paying to acquire these startups, but this was really the name of the game at the time. One other, I think, significant event that happened during this period was, I don't know if many people remember this, but there was talk about establishing a $2 billion microchip plant in Ottawa. In fact, there was even land potentially set aside in Orleans to establish a Taiwan-based chip plant. And political leaders, including John Manley, the mayor at the time, who was Jim Watson, and an organization called Ottawa Economic Development Corporation had hot leads on getting a chip plant in Ottawa. But that deal fell through when the incentives that were required to attract the plant to Ottawa were just too expensive. So the implosion came, as you know, the NASDAQ reached its peak in 2000, the internet or .com crash happened, soon followed by the telecom crash. Next slide, please. So this ushers in the next era of tech in Ottawa, which an acknowledgement to Jim Bagnall at the Ottawa Citizen, who referred to this decade from 2001 to 2010 as Ottawa Tech's lost decade. But it also ushered it in what I refer as Fresh Founders, which is also the name of a networking group that is called Fresh Founders here in Ottawa. Now this image is a juxtaposition of these two generations of tech in Ottawa. On the left is the long downfall and disintegration of Nortel Networks from its peak in 2000 to its bankruptcy in 2009. Whereas on the right side is an image of the three founders of Shopify, who, by the way, made history today, announcing their second quarter revenue results exceeding $1 billion for the first time. So it really is quite amazing seeing that during this period, the demise of one giant with the emergence of Ottawa's next major player in tech. What I find interesting with the Fresh Founders generation is that for the first time in Ottawa, or say was a decoupling of this new wave of ventures from the R&D and telecom roots of the city. Next slide, please. Just as a personal aside, here was a subtle sign of the changes ahead. In March of 2007, I was up at Carleton University, and I and another professor at the university hosted a group called BarCamp. Now, BarCamp was this very unusual conference that appealed to, we'll say, techies who were working on cool ideas. And if you see in the red rectangle there is a fellow by the name of Toby Lutke from a company called Jaded Pixel. Now, Jaded Pixel was the predecessor to Shopify, and at this time, Toby was only maybe 18 months into this company called Shopify, and we invited him, or he wanted to come to talk about Ruby on Rails, and which is the software platform that became the engine for Shopify. The day before this event, there was a large event organized by Oakry. All the elites and major players of the Ottawa's tech community attended, and it was like two different worlds. Nobody from the previous day's event at Oakry had attended this event at Carleton, and vice versa. It was almost like a subtle sign that something was afoot, that there was this new age of fresh founders that were coming up in Ottawa. So this brings me to the final slide of part one. Are we now on the cusp of a transitional shift to a fourth year of tech in Ottawa? And I took this image of a recent organization called Backbone Angels. This is a group of employees and former employees of Shopify who are the new wealth in the Ottawa tech community. So what types of deals are they going to do? What are they going to be supporting in terms of diversity of entrepreneurs? Will R&D play a critical role in the next wave of innovation in Ottawa? Also, questions like what is the work from home and work from anywhere culture going to do in terms of impacting talent attraction and retention? So there's a lot of question marks, I think, that are fair to ask in terms of what's next for Ottawa's tech. So that leads us to part two of the conversation.
Thanks very much for that, Luc. Speaking as someone who's outside of the tech sector, evidently, it's really interesting to hear the background and the history of a sector that I personally find can still be somewhat shrouded in mystery. I find for something that's said to be so important to the city, I always find that interesting. So thank you for that nice, as you said, flyover of the history of the tech sector in Ottawa. Now, just before we get into the indicators, I have a question that I like to ask every one of our guest speakers with regard to their specific area, which is curious what you think the most enduring legacy of the tech community's contributions to the development of Ottawa has been. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I did struggle with that question because just the word legacy right away tells me that you're looking for an overarching legacy that's rooted in the past, that somehow is the foundation for the future. And I did struggle with what that legacy is. There's one part of me that says Ottawa was really a great place for newcomers who were venturesome, who had ideas that they wanted to pursue. So on the one hand, that's a cultural thing, and I think that's one legacy that I would highlight, is that it was a great place for someone who I would say maybe might be the underdog, who might not be able to afford to go to the hot spots, but Ottawa, it was a place, like Toby's a good example of that.
Okay. Excellent. I think that's pretty good. We have Rob joining us now, so I think we can go to the first of our indicators on our PowerPoint slide, which I believe is employment and tech employment and companies. So this is a pretty obviously fundamental idea to a certain industrial or employment sector in a city. The interesting thing about it is, as we can see here on the first slide, is just hearing about employment in companies in Ottawa in the tech sector, it's really interesting how the different measurements with regards to the statistics of employment and the number of companies in a city, how many different ways there are to gather those numbers, and how they can be, I hesitate to use the word skewed, but how they can change depending on how you gather the statistics. So if you wanted to start us off, Luc, and Rob, please feel free to jump in as well with your thoughts on this. You know, I guess the first question I would have is, in terms of tech employment and in terms of the number of companies established here in Ottawa, are we stagnating? Are we falling behind? Are we moving forward in those numbers?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Steve, and one that's fraught with some a little bit of controversy over the past few decades. Is really what consists of a tech employee or a tech worker. And Rob will relate to this, is that, you know, we know that there's been different definitions depending on whether you use Stats Canada data or data that's supplied through our economic development agencies and so on. There were a time when those tech employment statistics were actually shared or seen as that same number by both those entities. But there came a period in the early 2000s when there was a split, when the Stats Canada numbers were different from the numbers reported by the economic development agencies. Now, for this slide, what I tried to do is try to find a more neutral source, although Stats Canada is pretty neutral. I went to the Brookfield Institute, who's a very well-respected think tank, and they produced this report, which is called Who Are Canada's Tech Workers? It was published in January 2019. And here what we're really interested in is the growth of tech employment, as opposed to the precise number at a point in time. And here, really what jumps out at you is how much three cities, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, have had a significant growth in tech employment over that decade. I don't know if Rob wants to join in at this point.
It is a question fraught with so many rabbit holes that you can go down when you talk about tech employment. But I also think that it's related to reputation. So I think when we started measuring these numbers very early on, even in my Oakry days back in the late 90s and early 2000s, we talked about this as a badge of honor, as a metric. And what strikes me always with these numbers is that it was a reputation builder for the city of Ottawa. We really took pride in the number of tech workers that were in our community, because we were always seen as a sleepy government town with the majority of the people sitting very comfortably in their government jobs. And the entrepreneurs and those guys like Terry Matthews and Mike Copeland, and I see Jim Roach on this call as well, and a guy like Jim Roach, it was almost like we never got the respect that was deserved as at the early days of being an entrepreneur. So there was a glorious moment. It was the late 90s, maybe it was like 2000, right before the crash, where we went very public and said, there are more tech workers in the city of Ottawa than government workers. And I think it lasted 4 days. And it was the greatest 4 days, about as long as the direct flights to San Jose in Silicon Valley. But it was one of these moments where we felt as a community that we had our moment in the light, and then it came down pretty quickly. But I think it stems from reputation, and it really did help bolster the reputation of the city of Ottawa at the time. Now I think it's fuddy-duddy, completely outdated and irrelevant at this stage. And I think a lot of the next generation of entrepreneurs in the technology sector would argue probably the same thing. It doesn't matter because of the way things have changed in the last 10 years on how we do business.
Yeah, good points, Rob. Yeah, maybe the next slide is related to the tech employment, and that's tech concentration. And on figure 8 on the top left of the slide, you'll notice the 5-year growth percentage change, looking at large cities, large urban centers, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, significant percentage change over 5 years in tech talent employment, in Ottawa at 1.5%. But where Ottawa has been using, we'll say from a marketing perspective, is our concentration or our percentage of total employment in tech that, historically, or at least in the last 10, 15, 20 years, Ottawa has had a very high proportion of employment in tech relative to total employment in the urban area. These are numbers from the CBRE report scoring Canadian tech talent released last year, and you can see on figure 10, it's a high of 11.3%. But I do caution again that depends on which numbers you're using for tech employment. If you're looking at Stats Canada numbers, there's a 20,000 employee difference than those reported by CBRE, which is 76,000. So the tech concentration numbers would put us lower to around 6 or 7%. So again, pick your numbers.
Yeah, that I have to say that 11.3% really stuck out, considering, you know, it's pretty towering over Toronto and Quebec and Waterloo. I know Waterloo is talked about a lot as a sort of a hub these days. And it's sort of interesting to pair that with what you brought up, that idea of reputation, the idea that Ottawa is a government town. It's a little dull compared to those other cities because of that. And so it's an idea that I hadn't even thought of, you know, using these numbers. You always want the best numbers, whatever your motivation is. So yeah, that 11.3 really stuck out. So it's interesting, just the variety of ways you can measure this indicator in terms of the tech sector. However, in terms of that, going back to that reputation idea for a second, if we actually want to go to the next indicator, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, on the next slide is, yes, entrepreneurship ecosystem. Now the word dynamism kind of sticks out for me here, because again, going back to that idea of it's Ottawa, it's quiet, it's a government town. I don't know if the word dynamism is a word that you usually hear associated with Ottawa in terms of side of government.
I specifically chose that word dynamism because it relates to this notion of what's called churn. You know, we often understand that startups, the shelf life of a typical startup is not that long. The survival rate is not that high. So you look for a high degree of churn in your ecosystem. You know, you have a lot of startups and some will continue after 3 years, 5 years, and so on. But what I find peculiar with Ottawa's, not the tech employment numbers here, but now we're talking about the number of tech companies, is these numbers specifically. So in 2001, so 20 years ago, it was well accepted that we had just over 1,000 tech companies in Ottawa. And then after the bust, the telecom crash, we had this enormous increase in 2006 to 1,800, roughly 1,800 tech companies. Now, one could argue that a lot of people who were laid off during the tech crash went up and started their own companies. This is a reasonable argument. So if that is the baseline 15 years ago, what I find a little bit strange, and I don't know if Rob, how you feel about this, is that the numbers have not really shifted that much over 15 years. There's not been a large fluctuation of tech companies, and I'm not sure what to read into that. Either we don't collect that data in the last 5 years, I don't know, but I just have a difficult time reconciling these numbers in my mind.
It is it's a riddle. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the way that you laid out the first and the second phase or eras of Ottawa's history in this. Is that it's a 50-year incubation period of R&D, translates into kind of 5 years of boom time, and then a trough again. So we've got kind of like these cycles, and I think that's what we're witnessing here, is that the immediate euphoria of the dot-com bubble kind of put everything out of perspective very quickly for a lot of entrepreneurs and one-time entrepreneurs, simply because it seemed easy at the time to build a business. And I think the reality is that we have a lot of churn because these ideas a lot of the ideas that are coming out as tech companies aren't fully baked, aren't sustainable, aren't competitive in a global landscape, can't attract investment because there's a lot of sameness that happens across Canada and North America. And VCs look at investing hyper local to where they are, as opposed to traveling across a continent to find a company that is an equivalent to their backyard. So a lot of it has to do, I think, with that realization that 50-year incubation cycle for R&D. Maybe it's not 50 years anymore, but there still has to be something there. You can't just put a new paint job on an existing business model and hope that it actually works. So I see that this is probably the leveling out that we see in these years, where a lot of churn, a lot of companies have spun up, tried something and failed. And I'm part of that cycle of trying something, doesn't stick, fail. And I think that it doesn't mean that this is where we're stuck. It just means that this is where we kind of bottom out before this next, what I hope is great R&D cycle emerges again.
Now, I have to I have to step in here for a second, bring up a little article I read today.
Oh boy! Don't do it! Don't do it, Steve.
And it's just it sort of piqued my interest because you speak of, you guys are talking about the churn. You guys are talking about that sort of, they're not fully there, but they're starting up anyways and then failing, and then starting up anyways and failing. And in an article in Narcity, I think it is, Ottawa was named apparently one of, and I'm not laughing because of the article or anything, one of the most ambitious cities in the world, just to clarify. So actually, Rob, I'll start with you. Any comments on that with in relation to the comments that you just made about the churn we've seen in the tech sector here?
It is very challenging for me to say anything that won't get me in trouble here. Ambitious is a very funny word here, because I think that the methodology of this entire report was based on how many people in this city search for starting a business. And everybody's got an idea. It's very difficult to follow through on that idea. So maybe ambition means like, armchair ambition. And I think that we saw a lot of that. I think that this has been consistent in Ottawa's history, is that we've had these moments where we're going to start up a bunch of companies. And I think it goes back to this ethos. For some reason it came out, which was, fail fast. This whole thought of starting a business and failing fast, like get to the end as quick as you can. And where what we should be doing is learning quickly and adapting. You don't go into a business to start to fail, and you don't give up when things get hard, because that's where the perseverance comes through. So rather than ambition, measured by how many times you search in Google about starting a business. Because trust me, I'm 51. I've been doing this for a long time. And every day I go into Google and say, what the fuck am I doing? How do I do this? How do I start a business? So, I mean, it's all in context around getting through the trough of despair when you're in the middle of trying to build a business and not giving up. So I think that there is ambition here. I just think it's measured improperly. That's as nice as I can be about this Narcity or this dojo report.
Yeah, I'll just follow up on Rob's quickly on this one. We can't pursue economic development and innovation policies in the city based on top 10 lists. Yeah. When you look at some of these sources of these top 10 lists, some of them are really pure PR type of thing. So when you look at the source of the Narcity, it's a UK-based payments company with absolutely no history in doing research or surveys of these matters. And even the metrics they use are hardly, or I'll say they're immaterial to the conclusion. So I think, it's one of a lot of top 10 lists that I think this one I would say is a tier 3 top 10 list. Sorry. really wanted to throw that in there just but
I think we can move to the next indicator, which is venture capital activity. So this one, I'll just be really brief for this one. I'm just curious, can we say again, are we progressing? Are we going down? Are we staying the same? That's just my question on that, but any comments you guys have on this specifically, please.
Well, this is a metric where the rubber hits the road as far as I'm concerned. And Rob knows this too. There's been some interesting articles by Sean Silkoff in Globe and Mail and Beta Kit, basically, saying, Canada is experiencing this tech boom. And you just have to look at the number of venture deals happening, particularly mega deals, which are $100 million rounds. Just this year alone, I think there's over 20 of these mega deals. It seems like there's a mega deal announced once a week. And you look at the numbers in 2019 and 2020, there was a dip. And already in 2021, we're on a record-setting pace for venture capital in Canada. And right off the bat, you could see that most or the majority of the deals are going to the GTA, followed by Montreal and Vancouver. That seems to be again the order. And Ottawa just announced there was a big deal with Turnstone Biologics last week for roughly 80 million US. So I mean that's a big deal for Ottawa, but we're not in the same leagues. So, and this is now the last few years. So if we crack top 5 in the last few years, that's an anomaly. Rob?
It's a very difficult thing for me to measure around the total volume of venture deals for the city of Ottawa. And related to the rest of Canada, Toronto has got such momentum, and I think that's the big word that you see in Toronto. And once you start getting in that flex of momentum, just keep building it. On Montreal and Toronto have that going for them at this stage, and it's just size of that city. Both of those cities really adds to it. There's. Like I'm a Yankees fan, and I'll tell you that adage of you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. And I think that really, if you can make it in Ottawa in the venture world, that's a shining beacon that you can make it anywhere in this country and anywhere in the United States. I think it's very difficult to be in Ottawa, and I if you listen to the history of a company like Shopify, that there was a lot of pressure for them to move, and it was just Toby steadfastly saying, look, we're going to stay as a Canadian company. We're going to stay in Ottawa. This is my home. This is where we'll always have. And he branched out, of course, and he's Shopify's everywhere. But it takes somebody like that to be able to stand his ground and commendably stand his ground and stay in the city, because there is an easy way. Oftentimes, companies get drawn out of this city. And really, I think that this stems from strong R&D, strong business models, things that people haven't seen before. What made Ottawa unique in the 70s and 80s was that it was bedrock for glass and fiber and infrastructure. And it was innovative, and people were building on it, and people were investing in it. And I think that right now we're running through a process where the money coming into Ottawa are layered on top of the infrastructure and the work that was done in the previous decades. And in order for us to compete effectively for venture money, we have to reimagine the world and start innovating again in that, and paint that picture, as opposed to really fighting a city like Toronto in the same industry. I think is one of the big things that I would put forward. But it's hard to judge how we're doing when it comes to venture, because the companies like Shopify were rejected often when they were trying to raise money for what they were doing today, and that seems in hindsight ridiculous, doesn't it? So there's a whole bunch of smaller companies in Ottawa that are approaching things completely differently, that aren't getting the visibility, that aren't getting the investment, because they're a little bit outside of the norm. They're a high risk, high reward opportunity, and it can lead to something great. 1Password is a perfect example in Toronto. They just raised a significant amount of money, and you know where a good portion of that money came from was the Shopify founders and Harley and Toby, and I think that what we would have looked at is 6 or 7 years ago, even 5 years ago, that we would need a password holder the way that 1Password manages it. I don't think that there was a lot of vision back then to see that was a real business. And sure enough, 5 or 6 years later, it's a $1 billion valuation. So I think that it's hard to judge.
I just want to, I do want to move on to the next indicator, just because I am very interested in getting into R&D. However, again, sort of, Rob, just following up on what you said there, it sounds like going back to that theme of perseverance, sort of saying, like, with regards to what you mentioned about Shopify, saying, I'm sure there were plenty of people pulling them in all directions from Montreal and Toronto, and he sort of just said, well, no, we're, for now, I'll say, not to predict the future or anything, but we're staying in Ottawa.
Well, Toby's a very, very, I think that you have this generational entrepreneur like Toby, like Terry, like Michael Copeland, like these Adam Schwiniak, like these guys who are based here and live here and work here and don't leave, and they'll build a business here. By God damn it, they will, just out of pure perseverance. And I think that's, you see it, these blips in the matrix where there is that guy who is in the right place, or that girl who's in the right place at the right time with the right mix. And it happened to be in Ottawa, and it's magic. It's a miracle if it happens once. And
Right.
something that you got to think about is that it continues to happen in Ottawa. Maybe not in the numbers that we would hope, but we're just naming guys and people that this has happened to before, and in this city. So there's some magic that happens when it's more than one person that gets struck by lightning in this city. And I think that it takes a unique person to persevere to stay here. You can't. I think that as a guy that's been doing this for a long time, there's nothing greater than the fact that they have stuck here, because I've been in meetings around the world where they say, like, I even work for a company called Lyft, and they're like, where is Ottawa? And I used to be able to pick up a phone and flip it over. It's like, here, it's Nortel or Mytel.
Right.
And I say, like, have you heard of a company like Shopify? Called Shopify. And they're like, yeah, but I thought that was in Toronto. I said, no, that is Ottawa. Like, so you have these beacons, and it is exemplary that they stayed in the city in order to give us that leg up.
Now, thank you, Rob. Now, in terms of R&D, Luc, just going back to your, again, a question for myself, going back to your presentation, I'm curious, you mentioned in the beginnings of the tech R&D in Ottawa, things like the NRC and defense spending as well, which I think generally can be ascribed to state spending or government spending in R&D. So I'm curious, over the next few years or decades, let's think long term, is R&D going to become that sort of bedrock again? And what is the relationship between, or what is the comparison between private and public funding in terms of that?
Yeah, we could spend like literally an hour having this conversation about R&D. I do question our traditional thinking around research and development as sort of the bedrock for new technology venture creation. And I think, the Shopify story in a way is not an R&D story. It's not like Shopify was created out of R&D. It was decoupled from R&D happening in Ottawa. And I think for me, just going forward in terms of R&D, is not so much that we produce the research, the R&D here, but that we have a capacity to absorb research and development happening elsewhere. I think breakthrough ideas happen anywhere and everywhere, but if we have a capacity to absorb what's going on in other places and out-innovate, then we have a fair shot of creating technology-based companies from that research. So the days of having this linear relationship between research and innovation and technology venture creation, we need to rethink that.
And last but not least, let's start with Luc again. Why not?
Yeah, very quickly. I brought up the clusters metric or indicator because clusters was the foundation of the economic development strategies going back to 1999 when the Ottawa Partnership was formed. It was called the Emerging Generators Project. There was a San Francisco-based consulting firm named ICF that was in town. Got a large contract by the city of Ottawa to develop this cluster-based strategy. And the idea was basically to diversify the economy, and in light of the telecoms disintegration in terms of a cluster, that there would be other clusters that would make up for that. Now, one could have a question about, did we succeed in these other clusters over the course of the next 10, 15 years? I would argue not. The one with the best bet was photonics. We had the talent base, we had the research infrastructure with NRC, we had the venture capital money coming in big time in the early 2000s. All the ingredients were there for that cluster to that's yet another indicator that, we of Ottawa's tech health.
Yeah, it's. I think there was. I think it was Jim Bagnall's article recently, talking about sort of how the sector is. Things are looking positive, I think, going forward. And one of the sort of things he framed that article with was the retrenchment after Nortel's collapse, which obviously was huge. But it did seem that you went from things like the NRC, government R&D, and then you had the telecommunications sector that just dominated. And the fact that the whole sector, at least again, speaking as, from an outsider's perspective, it just seemed like when that one company falls, it prevents the entire tech sector of the entire city from making any strides forward for like a decade. I mean, is that sort of, it's obviously a really simplistic way of framing it, but I mean, does that sound familiar in any way, or how would you approach that?
Well, this brings up the issue around the notion or concept of anchor companies. A bit like in a shopping mall, you have a large anchor tenant which draws all the people, and other smaller tenants benefit from that. Same thing in the technology cluster model, is you've got this anchor company, and I just don't know if this anchor company concept is as valid today. Look at Shopify. Shopify's only got 1,200 of its 10,000 employees here in Ottawa. Can we call it an anchor company? It's debatable.
Yeah.
And also, I do mention the Canada Research and Technology Park, which is Canada's largest research park. There is also a cluster of companies there too. But can we say there's an anchor company there? Arguably not.
Yeah. Now, Rob, just before we get to the Q&A, do you want to contribute here to the clusters discussion?
I would echo what Luc is saying, is that we have named companies in the city of Ottawa that we can all point to and make a reference point. So I spent my entire youth driving the Queensway and seeing that golden building with Corel at the top of it, like just all my life, every time. One way down, one way going to school at Algonquin, back and forth, and it was an anchor logo in an anchor building in a city that I was completely and utterly inspired by. I'd never met, and I've only met Michael Copeland once, but I can't tell you how much I gained from driving past that sign every single day. You can't express it, and I think that so we all have these anchor views. But what Ottawa needs is dozens of those anchors in the city, if not even anchors. We just need a norm of success with these businesses, an ability to allow them to grow and prosper and not get bought, not disappear, not move to Toronto. But we need not just one Shopify. We need 30 Shopifys, or 10 or 2 even at the same time. And that kind of diminishes the impact of one failing or one disappearing. And when Nortel imploded, when Nortel was winning, the city was on top of the world. When Nortel was losing, the city lost its grasp on who it was. And I think that, but that doesn't take away from the people, because the people stepped out of Nortel and started incredible companies, but it just didn't have the same, I don't know, we didn't put it up as high as we did as we did Nortel on top of the mountain. So I think that we need to let these companies breathe a little bit and grow. And coming back to these clusters, it's an interesting thing. Like maybe it's contrarian, but I don't believe that you can. I think you can expose kids to being entrepreneurs as an option for their career choices. I just don't think you can build entrepreneurs. I think that you innately have it inside of you, and you somehow it comes out. And it's a disease. I really think of entrepreneurship as a disease. But I think you have it in you. And I think it's the same thing with clusters. You can't force things together and build things that aren't there. And I think that there's a natural thing that happens in a city like Ottawa where if you don't fit into a cluster or something that everybody's focusing on, you're a pariah. And I think that that's a bigger challenge, is that I just don't think you can build an entrepreneur from scratch. I don't think you can build a cluster. because we had opportunities to do it. And as Luc said, sometimes they don't stick. I think that we can embrace some of the technologies that are emerging and some of the R&D that's emerging. But it's ultimately up to the entrepreneurs to be able to stake their claim in that space first and foremost.
Yeah. Now,
you're allowed to tell me to stop speaking.
No,
Steve, it's okay.
Never. I could never do that. I chuckle at the. I don't chuckle. I appreciate the mention of Corel is what I wanted to say, because I think it would. I don't know how many years it took me to stop calling it the Corel Center. That's what I grew up.
But what Michael Copeland had was the audacity to say that he was going after Microsoft. You know, whether it was a good idea or not. But I remember those days where he would stand and he'd say, like, they bought WordPerfect, and he's like, we're going to go and get Microsoft. And it was the first time, like, I don't know if it was a great idea to do at the time, because Microsoft, you know, was full Bill Gates aggression.
Right.
But what that meant to a 19-year-old kid trying to find his way was something that you look at Toby as to me, it's the same thing. And I always think of, like, Terry Matthews is the same way. Like, I think of when Trudeau said, you know, just watch me. I think of those entrepreneurs doing the same thing. It's like, you know what? Just watch what we're capable of doing.
Well,
and I think that's what's important.
On that note, actually, one of the first questions, or one of the first comments we got from Peter McKinnon was regarding a comment on Nortel acquisitions, which he says the firm gained no measurable economic technical benefits for Nortel. In Peter McKinnon's opinion, the company's mergers and acquisition strategy was a disaster. Any quick thoughts on that? I just wanted to get your quick reactions on that before we move on to other questions.
I don't think too many people who know the Nortel story would argue with that. And I remember when they bought a company called XROS, if I got that right, it was like a $3.2 billion acquisition for a company that hadn't been around not even a couple of years, had no revenue, had no product.
Wow. All right.
But I would have taken that buyout as well. I mean, that was the time, you know, like,
yeah.
I find it really hard. Like, you're right. These deals were vapid and fairly translucent, and not a lot of value emerged. But I mean, think back to that time. Like, if you just think back to these, like, 24 months of that
insanity
.com boom, it was insane. It was insane. So, like, you know, just like whatever we're going to go through and emerge out of the pandemic, you can't look at, like, these last 16 months as an indicator, and you can't look, I think, as those 2 years or 3 years as an indicator. I mean, $1.1 billion was invested in the city of Ottawa in 1 year. Like, so it was just a weird time.
From a gentleman named Greg Mattiusi, who may or may not be my father. Question on are Ottawa's research centers and universities in a good position to set off the next big R&D wave? Who would like to challenge that or take that on?
So right now, if you just look at the level of R&D at Ottawa U, Carleton, and Algonquin in terms of applied research, it's about 425 million, 450 million. That's even combined a shade of U of T's. But what's more important is not so much the amount on research, it's what areas are they focusing on. When I was at Carleton, I was seeing the benefits of the object-oriented research group, which led to 3 or 4 very important startups in the community, including Object Technology International with Dave Thomas, Object People, and so on. And then there was the Department of Electronics also at Carleton, which seeded a number of startups during the boom times. Mm-hmm. So to me, you know, I've been sort of away from the university environment right now. I know U of O has a tremendous leadership in photonics. You know, it's really hard to predict whether there's enough critical mass in research that we're going to see the universities become sort of the platform for the next startups. I doubt it, but they have a role to play in producing the talent.
I think, kind of speaking to that point, talking about tech growth, there's a question here from Tony Wolfarth. Every detriment I've ever seen or I've ever read of tech growth refers to the HR side. What lifestyle factors attract and retain talent? Examples: schools, recreation, infrastructure, languages, housings, etc. What factors does Luc see as key for the National Capital Region?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think what I would focus on that is talent attraction and retention. I think this is going to be the name of the game. Certainly with post-pandemic work from anywhere, what does talent attraction really mean anymore? Look at Shopify going completely virtual. That really changes the dynamics around talent attraction in terms of a physical location. But I do agree in the sense that I think having the basics covered, good infrastructure, good schools, low cost of housing, all these things play a big part in the attractiveness of a place. We're seeing the dynamics now in technology towards superstar cities. So the superstar cities, which Toronto's clearly becoming one of them, are inordinately attracting that talent. We need to think of ways to out-innovate or, if we're going to succeed in attracting and retaining talent. I'm a big fan of trying to develop local talent or nurturing local talent. I think that's one strategy that's undeveloped.
Yeah, I would add to that on the talent side. I mean, we're now, maybe it's shifted from attracting into the city to attracting to a company or a specific mission that the company is on. And I think that that's an interesting piece, is that it comes down to brand as well for me around the company. So if there's a company that is fighting for a cause or challenging a norm or building something that's very unique, and that happens to be in Ottawa, a talent will be attracted to it. So, Ottawa is a wonderful city to live in. And once people come into the city, they realize that it's a wonderful city. It's very hard to uproot people and bring them into the city. And it's very easy to get them attracted to a good company that's doing something in the city. One of the biggest challenges we have, though, is that it's the way that we're portrayed on the news. So it is when something is legislatively done, Ottawa did it. You know what I mean? And it's big government, and it's so when people say it's not the government, or it's not the government of Canada, it's Ottawa did it. Ottawa sent in the troops. Ottawa cut funding. Ottawa this. And so we're battling this brand reputation up here about the city, and that's what people hear. And so I think that you're fighting these two things, is that Ottawa has the government challenge, which is we're in the news every day about something that our government is doing. But then on the other side of it is that it all stems from the challenges that our companies and our entrepreneurs are trying to solve. And I think that that's really where we have an opportunity to thrive, is to brand by company, which may go against the norm here. But I think that if we're building great technology in the city of Ottawa, those companies will attract the right people.
I think going against the norm is the theme of the last year and a half. So maybe that'll be the catalyst for that. I have a couple comments here again that I just sort of want to share with you guys. From Claude, the legacy, this goes back to the question that I asked right at the beginning of the discussion period. The legacy is the breadth and depth of talent in Ottawa due to 3 significant post-secondary institutions and many startup companies. Seems like a decent summary, I think. And the other comment
why didn't he just chime in at the beginning, and then we could have just saved everybody a lot of time.
The other comment is from Tom Bryant. And I think this goes back to Rob, again, what you were saying, sort of like the startups constantly starting up and failing and sort of not pursuing that. He says, if it ain't failure, if you learn from those experiments. Which, yeah, I guess is an all-around fair comment.
It is, but I would argue, Tom, that like the thing is that you're not aiming to fail, and what I worry about, especially with a young generation of entrepreneurs, that they've been taught that failure is a badge that you wear proudly, and it does help you move forward. But all these companies that we've talked about, that we look at, Jaded Pixel, it failed into Shopify. You know what I mean? Like, so if they had given up and they had said, okay, just shelf it. Like, think about all of the things that would never have been built by these entrepreneurs that just stuck with it. And I think that that's what I'm trying to say here, is that it's not about the failure. You learn your lessons and you move forward from it, but it's not giving up too soon. In order, at the precipice of success is usually when it's the darkest and the deepest hole you're in, and you don't see the light. And that's really where it's a little bit of perseverance. You can't be crazy and hold on too long, but you need that perseverance to push through. So don't give up too soon.
Just because we're 10 past 8, and there's still a couple that I want to get to. I'm actually going to pair 2 of them together. So sorry to the 2 who asked these questions, but I think you can kind of pair these 2 together. And I'm going to pair, so one of them is the influence of Ottawa's large, well-paid government labor force for supporting innovation. And the other is, what do you think in the early development of Ottawa led it to becoming an R&D center? And I'm just going to sort of pair those 2 together in the sense of, did the influence of having a large government labor force, well-paid labor force, contribute to Ottawa becoming an R&D center, or was it simply the fact maybe that it was the national capital and that was sort of the natural place to put the National Research Council and things like that?
Yeah, well, the NRC's been around, well before World War II, so its presence in Ottawa was already quickly rooted. So when the wartime research effort really got going here, almost by default, Ottawa, call it, benefited from that. So already the work we were doing in radar, microwave, signal processing, and so on, was going to take place here. But after World War II, that research found a home in places like Computing Devices Canada that commercialized some NRC research. So that created already some momentum. And then when the Northern Electric, certainly by the 50s, established a presence in Ottawa, the private R&D was also very important. In fact, even more important role. Just a quick note about the federal government. I think, I don't think we've really explored the full potential of having that presence in Ottawa outside of the procurement side, and the fact that the federal government was able to absorb a fair number of tech layoffs in the early 2000s after the crash, a bit of a shock absorber effect there. But again, we can go down that rabbit hole pretty fast.
Yeah, definitely. And this is why I have to say, again, personal comment here. This is why I really appreciate both of you participating tonight, because again, it's always sort of baffled me how it is something that seems to be held up as, a triumph of the city of Ottawa, that we are this sort of center, and it's something, again, to differentiate from the government town reputation. And yet there seems to, we could have hour-long conversations about very specific questions regarding these indicators, and regarding, does being the national capital affect the tech sector in Ottawa? And it just seems like it's a very under-discussed sector, more broadly than, say, outside of the usual circles.
Well, I just find the fact that it was the 50th anniversary of Bell Northern Research should, in effect, be a very substantial recognition that should happen in this city. I think Neil Reed mentioned something in the questions to the panelists, and I agree with his point. I don't know if people can see his question, but he be contending that Nortel's weakness or failure really feeds back to BNR being folded in, and the whole culture of the innovation happening at BNR was basically extinguished when it was folded in. And I agree with that. So, we should be talking and celebrating successes like BNR's 50th would be right up there.
Yeah.
And also storytelling more of our local tech founders, I think, is another thing. I once did a class, a 4th year class, I won't say where I spoke about Steve Jobs and Terry Matthews. I asked the class, raise your hand, who's heard of Steve Jobs? Of course, everybody lifted their hand. Then I asked, who's heard about Terry Matthews and Mitel? I had one student out of 40 lift their hand. So there's something,
Yeah,
we do not do a good job of, and I think that's part of who we are in Ottawa as well. But I think that there are incredible leaders in this city doing incredible things in this city that nobody's ever heard of, and they will emerge and or get bought, and nobody will ever have heard of them. And I think that's a travesty.
Yeah, yes. Well, I not to agree or disagree on any points here as official moderator or anything like that, but I will just nod my head to that. So it is 8:15, so we've kept people here for a while. So I really want to say thank you to Luc and Rob for participating tonight. We really appreciate it. We really appreciate all your work and helping to put this together and discuss these issues and give us that a nice start to telling the story of the tech sector in Ottawa, at least to this crowd here tonight. So thank you very much to you, Luc and Rob. And I'm just going to take a moment as well here at the end, because as I mentioned at the beginning, this is technically, for the moment, our final virtual talk. So before I get to my thank yous, if you are interested in finding out more about the Bytown Museum specifically, or hey, making a little donation or becoming a member, check out our website at bytownmuseum.com. And so it's been a heck of a year and a half. For the last 9 months now, we've been able to work together with some great individuals and groups in our city who've brought together some wonderful histories about and discussions on the groups and the topics and the sectors that have made Ottawa what it is today. So this, again, for the moment, is our final talk. We're taking August off. So I hope you've enjoyed these talks as much as I have. I know I'm much more knowledgeable about our city and its residents than ever before, not to mention after tonight, the great tech sector here in Ottawa. As always, thank you to our guest speakers and my colleagues, Rebecca, Renee, Anu, Grant, and Robin at the Bytown. Everyone came together to make basically what was at the time a passing suggestion at a staff meeting come to fruition in the form of these talks. So thank you to everyone and to all our viewers as well. If this is your first Beyond Bytown virtual talk or your 6th, thanks for your time, your support, and your enthusiasm.